That weird theme song? Those cute little adventures? It felt chaotic, silly, harmless. But here's the part nobody talks about. Rugrats wasn't really about adventure. It was about grief, about anxiety, about being small in a world run by distracted, overwhelmed adults who don't realize what their silence feels like from the floor. The monsters were never the scariest thing in this show. The scariest thing was how often the adults simply weren't paying attention. Today, we're looking at 20 moments that prove Rugrats was never just a kid's cartoon. And by the end, one detail is going to reframe the entire series. Because once you see what the adventures really represent, you can't unsee it. 20. Mother's Day and the unspoken canon of grief. There is no moment in the history of Nicktoons more emotionally raw or devastatingly real than the Mother's Day special. For years, the absence of Chucky's mom was just a fact of the show. But in this Season 4 episode, the writers confronted it head-on. The story centers on Chucky's confusion as his friends make gifts for their moms, a concept he can't grasp. This wasn't a throwaway plot. It was a deliberate and heartbreaking exploration of loss. The climax, where Chaz finally opens a box of his late wife Melinda's belongings, is almost unbearable to watch as an adult. He reveals that Melinda passed away from a terminal illness shortly after Chucky was born. He reads Chucky a poem she wrote for him from her hospital bed, a final message of love from a mother he never got to know. This episode single-handedly introduced an entire generation of children to the concepts of premature death, parental grief, and the struggle of a single parent trying to preserve the memory of a lost loved one. It was so bold and so unusual for children's television that it remains one of the most talked about episodes in the network's history. The real gut punch isn't just the sadness, it's the profound respect the show gave to a topic most kids' programming wouldn't dare touch. 19. The Last Babysitter was a straight-up slasher film. The series loved playing with genre, but The Last Babysitter doesn't flirt with horror, it commits. Susie's teenage sister, Alyssa, is stuck babysitting, and the episode immediately starts speaking in slasher tropes. Creepy phone calls with nobody on the other end, then the power cuts out and the house stops feeling like a home. It feels like a set, like a trap. The babies, already primed by a monster book, become convinced something is lurking in the basement, and the show shoots it with real suspense. Shadows, strange noises, long beats of silence where your brain fills in the worst option. From their perspective, Alyssa becomes the final girl, and they're the helpless victims in a story where the adults aren't coming to save you because the adults aren't even aware there's a problem. It's a clever parody if you're older, but if you watched it as a kid, you didn't get the joke. You just absorbed the fear, the idea that your safest place can turn hostile in seconds, and you're small enough that no one takes your panic seriously. And once Rugrats proves it can do horror this cleanly, it starts doing something worse. It brings that same dread into episodes that aren't even horror on paper. 18. Angelica's nightmare was pure surrealist body horror. Angelica is usually the villain you laugh at until Angelica's worst nightmare makes you realize how scared she actually is. After hearing her parents might be having another baby, she has a nightmare that doesn't feel like a goofy kid dream. It feels like her mind breaking the world on purpose. The imagery gets distorted and ugly. A monstrous, deep-voiced baby brother who torments her. Her parents' faces melting and warping, reality itself turning hostile like it's pushing her out. The style shifts into something almost psychedelic. Too uncanny, too wrong, because the fear isn't a new sibling. It's replacement. It's becoming background noise in your own house. And there's a quiet sadness underneath it, too. The episode subtly hints her parents may have experienced a miscarriage, which makes her panic feel less like bratty jealousy and more like a kid picking up on grief and tension she can't decode. That's what makes it stick. It isn't scary because it's intense. It's scary because it's specific. It turns a child's insecurity into a literal horror landscape, and it leaves you with this uncomfortable thought. Angelica isn't just mean, she's terrified. 17. Chucky's watermelon seed was a body horror episode. The fear of something wrong taking root inside you is one of the oldest body horror instincts there is, and Rugrats hits it with terrifying literalism in the inside story. Grandpa Lou tells the babies an old wives' tale: swallow a watermelon seed and it'll grow in your stomach. Chucky accidentally swallows one, and you can almost feel the moment his panic becomes physical. What follows isn't a goofy misunderstanding, it's a nightmare. Inspired by a sci-fi movie, the babies imagine shrinking down and going inside Chucky's body to stop the seed from growing. His insides become this cavernous alien landscape, and the watermelon isn't a joke anymore. It's a looming entity, expanding, threatening to make him burst from the inside out. For a child watching, the line between fantasy and reality is thin enough to cut yourself on. A silly superstition turns into a visceral possibility. And the episode exploits the cruelest truth about childhood. If you don't understand biology, your own body can feel like the scariest place you've ever been. And once fear moves inside you, the show starts finding new places to hide it, like the adult world itself. 16. Special Delivery and the Terrifying Reality of Getting Lost. Special Delivery is played for laughs, but the premise is basically a parent's nightmare filmed like an industrial horror short. Tommy mishears a conversation about a new doll being delivered and decides he's getting a baby sister in the mail. So he hides in a mailbag and vanishes into the machinery of the adult world. He's taken to a massive postal sorting facility, portrayed as a dangerous, mechanized labyrinth, conveyor belts, stampers, crushing metal, systems that don't see you, they just process you. Tommy narrowly avoids being crushed and stamped, and he's even sent to the dead letter office, depicted as a graveyard of lost mail, complete with a skeleton. That one image is the episode telling you what this really is. A place where things disappear and don't come back. The scale, the noise, the indifference of the workers, it all makes Tommy's vulnerability feel unbearable. And the darkest part is the quiet part. The entire story rests on parental neglect. A 1-year-old escapes his home and navigates a hazardous industrial environment without any adult noticing. The show turns a child's most basic fear, getting lost, into something bigger and colder. Being swallowed by systems that don't care you're alive. And when the babies try to make sense of that kind of power, they start copying it. 15. The Trial was a cynical takedown of the justice system. An episode that should be about a broken lamp becomes a bleak parody of legal proceedings. In The Trial, Angelica sets up a mock court to decide who broke Tommy's favorite clown lamp, and the court is rotten from the first second. She appoints herself the persecutor, then turns the whole thing into a performance of power, cross-examining the other babies, steering the narrative, deciding what counts as truth. The episode drops shockingly adult ideas into a playroom. False accusations, witness intimidation, and evidence manipulation. Angelica twists Phil and Lil's story until it sounds like a confession, and she weaponizes Chucky's deepest fears to try to force him into admitting guilt. It's a kangaroo court run by a tyrant who doesn't want justice. She wants control. The bleakest message isn't hidden at all. Truth is irrelevant when the person in charge is willing to bend reality hard enough. The episode ends with Angelica accidentally confessing, but only after it's made its point. Even at the playground level, justice can be used as a tool for personal gain. And what makes that scary is what comes next. The show doesn't just hint at cruelty, it starts showing consequences. 14. Naked Tommy was a bizarre exploration of social rebellion. What starts as a dumb gag in the episode Naked Tommy quietly turns into something way stranger. A tiny kid stumbling into rebellion by accident. Inspired by Spike, Tommy decides he doesn't want clothes anymore. He embraces a naked lifestyle like it's the most logical thing in the world. And that's what makes it unsettling. The adults don't react like this is a harmless phase. They react like it's a contagion. Dee Dee panics and runs to Dr. Lipschitz for answers, while Betty goes full scorched earth, furious, accusing the Pickles of being hippie freaks and forbidding her kids from playing with a nude Tommy. The episode treats Tommy's nudity not as baby being silly, but as a conscious rejection of rules he can't justify. Why do humans have to wear things that feel uncomfortable when animals don't? Why is everyone so ashamed of something he doesn't even understand yet? It's bizarrely philosophical. Individuality versus social pressure played out through the smallest possible act of defiance. And the darker subtext is obvious. Conformity isn't taught gently. It's enforced. And once the show proves it can turn a normal childhood moment into a fight against authority, it goes somewhere even colder. The doctor's office. 13. The Shot turned childhood medical fear into legitimate horror. Nearly every kid is afraid of getting a shot. Rugrats takes that fear and films it like a monster movie. In the episode appropriately titled The Shot, the story is driven by Chucky retelling his experience at the doctor's office like it's a war story. Terrifying, embellished, and deadly serious. And the show stacks the deck. The pediatrician is literally named Dr. Lecter, a chilling nod to Hannibal Lecter. You're not meant to feel safe. In Chucky's flashback, the doctor becomes this looming, malevolent authority figure, and the needle isn't a tool, it's a weapon. The fear spreads. Tommy gets infected with it so completely that he and another baby in the waiting room attempt an escape, triggering a chaotic chase through the medical facility. The episode nails the subjective reality of childhood fear. When you're small, powerless, and confused, a routine procedure can genuinely feel like a life or death struggle, and what's worse than a doctor you can't trust? The feeling that love itself can be taken away. That's where the next one hit. 12. Spike's Babies was a gut-wrenching story of replacement anxiety. This one doesn't need horror imagery, it just presses on a primal nerve. When Tommy sees Spike spending all his time with a new litter of puppies, who are actually kittens Spike has adopted, he doesn't interpret it as something sweet. He interprets it as replacement, as Spike moving on, as being quietly pushed out of the spot he thought was his. Tommy's jealousy and sadness are palpable because the episode doesn't treat it like a tantrum. It treats it like a real emotional crisis rooted in one fear: being forgotten. And that's why it lands so hard. It's not about pets, it's about hierarchy. About watching affection get redistributed and not knowing what that means for you. About the terror of being deemed unworthy of love and having no language to argue your case. And once you've seen how easily the show can make a toddler feel disposable, you're ready for what comes next, because the next episodes don't just show fear, they show people using it. 11. Circus Angelicus was a disturbing depiction of exploitation. Angelica's bossiness was a constant, but the episode Circus Angelicus pushed it into the realm of outright exploitation and abuse of power. After becoming obsessed with being a circus ringmaster, Angelica doesn't just ask the babies to play along, she forces them into becoming her unwilling performers. She manipulates them, assigns them difficult and demeaning tasks, and essentially creates a miniature sweatshop for her own amusement and gain. The power dynamic is deeply unsettling. She is the tyrannical boss, and the babies are her exploited workers, too naive and powerless to fight back effectively. This goes far beyond simple playground bullying. It's a depiction of how a charismatic and ruthless individual can dominate and control others, a surprisingly dark lesson about labor and power dynamics for a preschool audience. And once the show is willing to frame childhood as a workplace with a boss, it starts digging into a scarier truth. The adults are still bleeding too. 10. The Chaz dating episodes were uncomfortably realistic. Long after the Mother's Day special, Rugrats keeps returning to Chaz Finster's life as a widower, and it doesn't sanitize it. The episodes where Chaz tries to re-enter the dating world don't play like wacky sitcom plots. They play like real life. Awkward silences, forced smiles, insecurity you can practically hear in his breathing. You watch him go on a series of disastrous dates, and the tension isn't, will he find love? It's, can he even stand being seen like this? Because underneath the comedy is a pressure that feels incredibly adult. Trying to move forward without betraying the person you lost. Trying to find a partner while still honoring Melinda's memory. Trying to parent while carrying grief that never fully leaves the room. That's why these storylines hit harder than they should in a cartoon. The sadness isn't dramatic, it's familiar. And while Chaz is stumbling through the present, the show quietly reminds you that even Grandpa Lou's jokes come from somewhere darker. 9. Grandpa Lou's war stories were real. A recurring gag in the show was Grandpa Lou dozing off and launching into rambling stories from his past, often starting with 15 miles we walked. While the babies ignored him, attentive adults would notice that many of his stories contained explicit references to his time serving in the Big War. He would mention digging foxholes and life in the trenches, grounding his character in the very real, traumatic history of World War II. These weren't just the ramblings of an old man, they were fragments of genuine historical trauma bleeding into the periphery of a children's cartoon. This backstory added a layer of depth and melancholy to his character, suggesting that his eccentricities were shaped by experiences that the colorful, suburban world of the show could never fully comprehend. And if that feels too dark for a kid's show, the next one proves it wasn't accidental. Because Angelica doesn't just scare the babies, she studies them. 8. Angelica's manipulation was master-level psychological warfare. Angelica Pickles wasn't a typical 3-year-old bully. She didn't just grab toys and scream until she got her way, she orchestrated. Her schemes were calculated, almost surgical, designed to sow fear and discord in the group. And what makes it feel so wrong is how specific she is about it. Angelica understands the pressure points of each baby. Chucky's cowardice, Tommy's stubborn sense of justice, the twins' codependence, and she exploits those weaknesses with precision. It's not random cruelty, it's targeted. And then there are the monologues. Those moments where she speaks directly to the audience and you realize she's not just mean, she's self-aware. She uses gaslighting, propaganda, emotional blackmail, tools that shouldn't exist in a toddler's mouth, and the show treats it like comedy while quietly depicting a disturbingly accurate portrait of a high-functioning manipulator. Angelica isn't chaos, she's control. And once you notice that, the next horror isn't a villain, it's the environment that makes her tactics work. 7. The constant threat of being lost in public. This motif shows up again and again, the babies wandering away and getting lost in sprawling public spaces, giant toy stores, cavernous supermarkets, crowded shopping malls. The show frames these sequences to induce real anxiety. It drops the camera to the baby's eye level, and suddenly the world becomes a forest of giant legs and towering shelves. Everything is too loud, too big, adults move like unthinking machines. No one looks down. From a parent's perspective, it's a nightmare. One distracted moment and your child is gone. But from the child's perspective, it's worse. It's a survival scenario. The outside world isn't wondrous. It's hazardous and confusing, built for bodies 10 times their size, where the threat of permanent separation from their parents is always one wrong turn away. And that fear doesn't stop at the mall. Because back home, the show hides another kind of instability, one you only understand when you're older: money. 6. Stu's failing inventions were a metaphor for financial instability. Stu Pickles is framed as the lovable, bumbling inventor dad, comic relief with a screwdriver and a dream. But the longer you watch, the darker the running gag becomes. His inventions almost always fail spectacularly. Explosions, messes, wasted time, and beneath the slapstick is the quiet implication of debt and precarity. It's the kind of background stress kids can't articulate, but they feel it. The tension in late nights, the frustration, the pressure to make something work. Stu's all-night invention sessions in the basement aren't just quirky. They raid like desperation, the actions of a man chasing a dream that never quite pays the bills, trying to provide for his family in a precarious, gig economy-style career. The show never says financial anxiety out loud, but it's there, humming under the floorboards. And once you realize the adults are unstable too, the next entries stop being weird moments and start feeling like symptoms of one bigger problem. 5. Dee Dee's parenting anxiety was painfully relatable. Dee Dee Pickles was a portrait of a mother consumed by anxiety. Her slavish devotion to the teachings of child psychologist Dr. Lipschitz was the show's most direct commentary on the pressures of modern parenting. She was constantly worried she was doing everything wrong, turning to dense, often contradictory advice books rather than trusting her own instincts. Dee Dee was frequently shown as overwhelmed, stressed, and second-guessing every decision. This was not an idealized, perfect TV mom. She was a realistic depiction of a loving parent terrified by the overwhelming responsibility of raising a child in a world that offers endless, conflicting advice on how to do it right. Her anxiety was the emotional core of the show's parental world. And once you realize how anxious the adults are, you start hearing their conversations differently because, to a baby, every sentence can sound like a threat. 4. Misinterpreted adult conversations created a world of constant peril. The show's central joke, babies misinterpreting adult conversations, is also the engine for its darkest moments. Because they take everything literally, the babies live in a world where casual adult remarks become coded warnings. A roast in the oven can sound like a plan to cook one of them. Firing someone from a job can sound like an execution, and the adults never notice the damage because to them it's just talk. But to the babies, it's a steady drip of cryptic, terrifying messages they have to survive without context. That creates a baseline of paranoia. The adult world isn't guidance, it's static, half-heard fragments that turn normal life into constant incoming danger. The comedy comes from us knowing the truth. The horror comes from realizing the babies never can. And when you grow up into that kind of fear, there's always someone waiting to weaponize it, especially if they can tell you're the weakest one in the room. 3. Angelica's torment of Chucky was outright bullying. The dynamic between Angelica and Chucky was more than just a simple rivalry. It was a consistent and cruel pattern of psychological abuse. Angelica seemed to take a special, sadistic pleasure in terrifying Chucky, who was already the most anxious and fearful of the group. She would invent monsters, tell him horrific stories, and create situations specifically designed to trigger his deepest phobias. Her torment wasn't aimless. It was targeted and relentless. She enjoyed watching him suffer. This dynamic was one of the most realistic and therefore disturbing depictions of bullying in children's television. It showed how a predator can identify a vulnerable target and systematically break them down for their own amusement. And if that sounds bad in the real world, wait until the show ends those fears a costume and a soundtrack, because the baby's imagination doesn't soften anything, it turns it into horror. 2. The fantasy sequences were often stylized horror. Whenever the babies slipped into shared imagination, the show didn't escape into candy-colored comfort. It leaned into darkness. Their fantasy sequences regularly borrowed the visual language of horror films, noir thrillers, and monster movies. Giant creatures that filled the frame, shadowy villains with faces you couldn't quite read, landscapes that felt hostile and endless. It wasn't cute pretend. It was the kind of dream logic where danger is everywhere and you don't know why, you just know you have to survive it. And that's the unsettling part. The baby's inner world is grim. Even before they have the words to explain fear, their minds are already casting themselves into stories of conflict, pursuit, and escape. Like that's the most natural way to process being small in a world that doesn't make sense. The show treats this like an adventure, but it plays like a confession. Because if the imagination is already this dark, it's usually reacting to something real. 1. The entire show was built on a premise of neglect. The ultimate secret of Rugrats is that none of it would be possible without the foundation of consistent, pervasive parental neglect. The babies were able to embark on their wild adventures for one reason. Their parents were not watching them. Stu was lost in his workshop, Dee Dee was absorbed in her books, and the other parents were consistently distracted by their own adult problems. The playpen was less of a safe space and more of a holding cell from which they would inevitably escape. The show's entire narrative engine was fueled by this lack of supervision. The baby's world is huge and terrifying and full of danger because the adult world is too busy, too stressed, and too self-absorbed to notice what's happening right in front of it. And that's the most unsettling truth the show ever tells. For a toddler, the greatest threat isn't a monster. It's the mundane, everyday moment when the people meant to keep you safe simply don't. And that's why the show hits different when you're older. Rugrats wasn't just edgy, it was honest. It treated childhood like it actually feels. Confusing, loud, unfair, and occasionally terrifying, not because the world is evil, but because it's indifferent. The jokes land, the monsters work, the adventures happen because the adults keep looking away. If you had to call it, was Rugrats secretly a horror show or just the most accurate kids show ever made? Pick one in the comments, and if you disagree, tell me what I'm missing. Don't forget to subscribe.